Alright, well, welcome to one of my favorite of all lessons, and this is the idea of speciation. How do we get so many of the wonder species that we see around us? Millions and millions of different kinds of living organisms here on Earth, and how did that develop from just a few from the beginning? And this is the idea of evolution, so we'll be taking a look at that. We've got to return back to Darwin, though. He's making his voyage around the Earth on the Beagle and observing. And he's in the Galapagos Islands. There's one of the stops 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, and he's walking around and he sees these giant tortoises. He talks about them being so big that they could actually ride on them. And look at the necks of these tortoises. As he looks at them, he sees two different variations. So not only you get tortoises on the island, but you get a couple of different variations of them. You get these long-necked ones that have a different shaped shell that allows their necks to stick up high, get some vegetation that's well above the ground. And then you get these shorter-necked ones with the saddle coming down low, the part of the shell coming down low prevents their head from going up and getting the higher vegetation. So he notices that. And then one of the most famous things that he noticed are these finches. In the breeding, what he wrote is he noticed the gradation in the sizes of the beaks. You can see that little, bigger, biggest, slight differences in the shape, a lot of differences in the sizes, and he ends up being 13 different species of finches, and he's looking at those and wondering, why so many different shapes, and how did this happen out on these islands 600 miles from the mainland? Then he comes back to the mainland and looks at dog breeding and sees, how do people end up getting different breeds of dogs, and he looks at how that process happens. We take a look at that in class, and he looks at the same thing in other places, such as in pigeons. I mean, look at some of these absolutely amazing pigeons. You're not going to find ones in wild like this. People breed pigeons the same way other people breed dogs, and look at all the different variations in the colors and where the feathers are and the tails, as people do use what's called artificial selection, picking for the traits in pigeons just as they do within dogs. And he begins to put all of this together, and he develops this idea of evolution, although he didn't call it that. The term came along a lot later. This is that descent with modification. Descent, we're talking about the young, and with modification, we're talking about changes. So we're talking about descent with modifications. As the young are born, they are slightly different than the parents. Okay, a lot of things are the same, but there's some slight changes, and these changes are a result of changes in the DNA. Okay, what do we call mutations? Just changes in the DNA. And some of these mutations many of them have no effect at all in terms of the survivability, how well the offspring are going to live. Some of these are negative, and some of these end up being positive things that help them to make it more likely that they're going to live to be adults. Now, he didn't talk about genetics because DNA hadn't been discovered yet. But evolution is these changes in the species over time that's passed down through the genes. If I cut off my finger, my child's not going to be missing a finger. It has to be a change within the genetics. We talked about that last semester. And then he's looking at that artificial selection. We talked about the breeding the dogs and the pigeons, and he applies that to the natural world, and he comes up with this idea of changes through natural selection. And there's four basic parts as we're going to lay it out. There's this idea of overpopulation, that more young are made than can survive to be adults. And we look at this idea of variation. Amongst those young, there's variation. They aren't all the same. And we look at this idea of adaptation. Some of those differences are going to give you an advantage. And finally, we look at this idea of selection. There's going to be the ones with better adaptations are going to be selected. They're going to be more likely to breed. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of that. So here we have our friendly neighborhood rabbit hopping around. And if you give the rabbit a friend, assuming one's male, one's female, it doesn't take long before, as they're hopping around, they end up having more rabbits. And so you get a bunch of rabbits hopping around. And it doesn't take long after that before you have even more rabbits. So this is that overproduction. But they're not all going to be the same. Some of them are going to end up looking a little bit different. Maybe they end up having a slight change in the pigmentation so that they have a brown fur. And that might give them an advantage when the wolves come through, because the white ones are just a little bit easier to find. The wolves don't care which color they eat. They'll take whatever they can find, but the white rabbits are a little bit easier to find. And the wolves come through again and again, and every time they come through, the white ones are just a little bit easier to find. And so you can see, even though we started with just a few of the brown ones, now the majority of the population has the brown fur, because those are more likely to become an adult and reproduce. And so you have offspring with brown fur. You'll get more. So this is that idea of natural selection. Okay, so if we return back to the notes, I asked you to write the definition of natural selection in your own words. I ended up saying something like, those individuals with better adaptations are more likely to have young, which are more likely to carry the new mutation. Okay, well, we can see it in places other than rabbits. Here's, take a look at, these are rock pocket mice. And you can see that, well, there's a slight change in one of the genes that allows some of them to have the dark colored fur. This is the natural fur, this is the mutation. And on these light colored rocks, the owls pick these off pretty easy, so these don't survive very long. Think sticklebacks and spines. But not far from that light colored rock, there's this volcanic rock, this basalt that's folded across. And there, these light colored ones, they stick out pretty well, and the owls come and pick these off. And so then the dark colored ones, the ones with the mutation in the gene, they're more likely to survive and become adults. And so you see more of the dark colored mice. They're still the same rock species, still the same rock pocket mice, but you see more of dark ones over here, light ones over there. We can also even look inside humans, and within humans we can see mutations arise that can be beneficial in some places. For example, some of you might know people who are lactose intolerant. Well, it turns out that was the norm, and among much of the world still is. Adults drinking milk, we're the only animal that does that. But there's mutation in the gene that allows some of us to be able to drink milk as an adult and
mutations arise at random in a
not get
population.
sick.
Suppose a mutation arises that causes adults to produce lactase in a population that doesn't have any dairy cows. Adults don't drink milk, so producing the lactase enzyme is a waste of energy. The mutation is lost or remains rare. If this same mutation arises in a population where people have domesticated cows, adults could drink milk without getting sick and gain energy from the sugar in the milk. They would be more likely to have children and pass on their genes, and the mutation would rapidly spread throughout the population.
Right. So there's an example that you might see in some of your own lives. Now again, going back to the notes, if we take a look at the next part, we still haven't talked about new species. We've just talked about some changes within the species, some slight changes within there. When we talk about speciation, we're talking about new species, new kinds of animals, separate from the original kind coming about. And this can come about in a variety of different ways. We're only going to take a look at one.
To illustrate the steps in the allopatric speciation process, we will examine a hypothetical lizard species. Before the process begins, there are populations of this species on both sides of a stream. Each population shows some degree of adaptation for camouflage to the local environment. Lizards occasionally cross the stream and interbreed with individuals on the other side, thus maintaining the populations as members of a single species. The allopatric speciation process begins when a climate change causes the stream to widen into a river. Lizards cannot cross the river, and so the two populations become geographically isolated. The river remains a geographic barrier for several thousand years. During that time, the populations become increasingly genetically different due to local adaptation and genetic drift. Now imagine that the climate changes again, and the river returns to being a stream. Lizards may, once again, cross to the other side. If the populations have become genetically rather different, interbreeding between individuals may not occur, and the two populations can be considered separate species.
So when they get these changes and they end up being separated for a long enough period of time where they no longer recognize each other for some reason, maybe they have different times of years that they mate now, maybe it's a different courting ritual, maybe it's the way that they look, they no longer recognize each other as the same species, then now you have speciation. Okay. One final return to the notes. I asked you at the end of this section, I asked you to draw a sequence map showing how the process of natural selection can cause evolutionary changes in a species using examples. We got overproduction, variation, adaptation, and selection, just as we did before. And then I'm going to use the example that the book used in their drawings. So, for example, in salmon, you have more salmon made than can survive. Some of these have the forked tail. The forked tail might make the fish faster, and the fork-tailed fish are more likely to breed in future generations. So you end up seeing more and more of the fork tails and less of the straight tails. Okay. If you need to watch any of it again or come in for help or ask me some questions during class, don't be afraid to. This is At a Day of Evolution, how we end up with so many different species here on Earth today.